I thought I'd start things off. I thought I'd ask Jane Hall, are we prepared against cyber attack? And how do you know when you're prepared?
I think at an extreme, we're not nearly as prepared as we need to be. For example, most of us are not implementing the 4 simple measures that could reduce our vulnerability by 80%, sort of the cyber equivalent of brushing your teeth, flossing, and visiting the dentist. We're not doing them. We need to start doing them, and we need to start doing them now.
And what are those measures?
You want to know what's on your network and whitelist your software. You want to limit administrative positions, and you want to execute real-time patching of your systems and your applications. And we do those now for no or low cost.
Scott, is this so? Are we lacking in some of the basic low-cost, no-cost steps?
In the case of the electric power sector, I disagree a little bit. We are the only sector, and I say this all the time, repeated, we're the only sector with mandatory cybersecurity standards. But to the former Deputy Secretary's point, that's not in and of itself a 100% solution. I think that at best is an 80, 90% solution. If you think of standards as that 90% solution, the next 9.99% of the solution, for all intents and purposes, is that close coordination. The north-south between the government and the private sector and the government. The government has intelligence gathering capability. The government has the ability, has a standing army, and then east-west across the sectors. If you think of the electric grid, in this case, it was a cyber attack that successfully took down the entire electric grid by what we assume, just by some of the inferences, insinuations rather, were a full frontal attack on the control systems of the grid. Well, there's a lot of ways to disrupt power. Deprive us of water, deprive us of fuel, deprive us of telecom, and you're going to have the same impact. So that north-south between those who have the intelligence and who have the standing army, and then the utilities who have the operating expertise, and then east-west across the industry, which is operating one big machine with thousands of owners, users, and operators, and across the critical sectors upon which we're interdependent, I think then you get closer to that 100% solution in preparedness against a dynamic threat. Cybersecurity, today's threats, today's threat actors, today's vulnerabilities may not be tomorrow's. And so standards, which we are very proud of, which give us that baseline level of security, are fantastic, but they're not nimble enough to deal with the dynamic nature of the threat that we're dealing with. That's where that coordination between government and industry comes in.
General Hayden, are we set up to look for threats the way we used to look for missile launches?
No, not in the same way. And it's a very difficult question for us. I mean, this domain, this cyber domain, is very new, and we're kind of like 15th and 16th century explorers in a new world, and we haven't worked out an awful lot of things that we've worked out in physical space and what it is we want the government to do. 90% of all this stuff is controlled by the private sector, not controlled by government. One of the most lively controversies right now in Washington throughout the country is the role of the National Security Agency. And if you want the National Security Agency out there as scouts out in order to be able to detect these things.
They got to listen to my phone calls?
Not quite, but they're going to bump into things that we're sensitive about. And we have not yet decided as a people, and it's just a genuine and a fair question, we have not yet decided what it is we want the government to do or what it is we will exactly let the government do to try to prevent these kinds of attacks.
But I guess having dealt with this for the past 4.5 years, what I would say is there are polar opposite ends of the debate. On one side, there are those who say the government has no role in cybersecurity. It haven't been given that assignment, unlike the assignment for security in physical space, keeping us safe on the streets, for example. And there are those who say, yes, 90% of our critical infrastructure is in private sector hands. Let the market address this problem of cybersecurity. On the other hand, there are those who say, no, the problem is so dangerous and so dire. Again, this was an extreme scenario, but it's not extreme to imagine that we would have to cope with extended power outages as a result of very complex attacks. But it's so dangerous.
Including some by Mother Nature.
Including some by Mother Nature, that it's so dangerous that only the government can handle this. Clearly, those two extremes, in my view, are wrong. So where should we combine our efforts, beginning with doing those things that we can do right now, the top 4 of the critical controls, and then focus our upper end efforts on that last 10 or 15%?
Let me ask Richard Reed, In the movie, magically, there are trucks, there are cartons of food, there are cartons of water. How well set up are we for a national catastrophe? I noticed a lot of the footage was from Katrina. I recognized other footage from elsewhere, but those are regional problems, not national problems.
You know, that's a great question. I think what we're after here is, you know, at the macro level is creating and sustaining a national resilient capability, which is more than your ability to prepare for something. It actually involves your ability to prepare for something, to then respond to that thing which you prepared for, and then recover from that thing that occurred. And so it's a more dynamic notion of what a community's or an individual's or a nation's responsibility is. And Jane and I were talking earlier about, you know, the president has said, you know, for the nation to be prepared, we have to do 5 things well. We have to be able to prevent things, bad things from happening. We have to be able to protect people, systems, society when bad things do happen. We need to be able to mitigate to the degree that we can, financially and otherwise, the risk associated with these bad things and buy that down. We need to be able to respond, and we need to be able to recover. And I think when you put those 5 things together, you create an elasticity in the system, the capability to withstand the impact of an event, and to adapt to the changing conditions, which I think adaptation is important because rarely, I think, do we go back and restart from pre-incident, from left of boom. What comes right of boom is oftentimes an evolution, and it's different. If you look at what happened in Katrina, if you look at what happened during the BP oil spill, if you look at what happened in Japan and Haiti and Joplin, Missouri, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Moore, Oklahoma, the recovery is done in such a way as to better prepare the community for the next event. And I think for events like cyber, whether they're man-made or naturally caused events, we can do a lot around not just having the capability to respond, but building the capacity for resilience.
So does that mean I should go out and buy my own generator?
You know,
or?
it may mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And if you understand what your vulnerabilities are, you have an insight into what you need to prepare for. Generators may be the answer for some. For others, it may be alternate energy sources and means. So I'm not sure one size fits all. It's really it's an exploration of your vulnerabilities, an understanding of your resources, not only yours, but those that you could leverage from neighbors. You know, within states, there's a concept of EMAC, Emergency Management Assistance Compact. It exists within industry where one power company comes to the aid of another power company, although there is no value to themselves, financial or otherwise. It's an agreement between sectors of a common infrastructure to provide mutual support. Families do it all the time. Communities do it all the time. Faith-based institutions do it all the time. So our national response capability is less about what FEMA brings to the table, and it's more about how we coordinate and collaborate together.
I should add, you asked me about defense, and this may actually be a domain in which resilience is going to be more key to survival than defense.
Than prevention.
Right.
Dr. Bristow, let's ask about resilience. What can a doctor do without electricity?
Well, I think we can do a lot of things without electricity, but I think the bigger question that I think the movie highlights is this question of community resilience. And if you look at an emergency management pyramid, usually the government is at the top and the community is really the foundation. And I think in our country, we are very strong at the top, but I think there's a lot of potential for activity and involvement at the community level. I had an opportunity to go to Japan after what we thought was kind of an unbelievable disaster. I spent a lot of time coming up with scenarios with professionals to do around the country, and we would have never come up with a scenario that complicated, an earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster. And we got there about day 7, and these communities that were sort of cut off from the rest of the government had enough resilience because of their preparedness and experience that they were actually doing okay. They had found places for the survivors to actually be able to put their beds. They had enough water and food within the community. And that's where the resilience is. And that's during a large-scale disaster like this, what you need is community resilience because there will be delays and limitations, you know, at the government, state, city, and hospital level.
I think that's exactly the kind of approach that FEMA has been undertaking over the past several years, which is let's look at how do we empower individuals with the information they need, the training, the knowledge, capability. How do we create capable communities? Because they know their members best. Where are our electrically dependent populations? Where are our most vulnerable? Is that bridge out? Will that road work? And then where can the federal system be most responsive and additive to efforts that really begin with the individual families and communities?
Let me actually go back for just a second. You're in New York, and I wonder what you see since Sandy. It's a year ago now.
Yes.
What's changed?
Well, I think we've had exactly what we've been talking about. There's been an enormous effort to look at building resilience in the community. So we're looking at healthcare systems, for example. So this sort of emergency preparedness model that we've been working on since 9/11 has really focused on hospitals. And now we're looking at bringing in adult care facilities and nursing homes and methadone programs and other types of, so building sort of partnerships or coalitions within the healthcare sector, and then actually reaching out to the community as well, looking at churches and universities and vendors, that could actually support a hospital if we were in a situation where we needed an extended amount of support. We have about 96 hours of planning in place that's sort of required through the Joint Commission, which accredits hospitals. So most hospitals have a plan of how to sustain their services for about 96 hours without needing external assistance. But at the 96-hour mark, we'll definitely need some assistance to be able to maintain services. And the community would be a great place to look for that support and assistance.
Scott, I think you wanted to jump in?
Well, I was going to say there's a certain maturity that develops over time with both the public and with the infrastructure and with the government, with the different participants or stakeholders who have something to do with response. Over the decades, literally, this is an industry, and mutual assistance was brought up earlier, that deals with acts of God, natural disasters. And I think there's a certain understanding. First of all, with acts of nature, everybody knows what happened. And I think that that's an important component to remaining calm and being prepared and sort of understanding on the individual, government, and industry level what responsibilities are and how all that plays out. With respect to, I guess, non-traditional, whether it's a physical attack or a cyber attack on electric infrastructure, cyber in particular is very new. But it is something that, because of our role as critical infrastructure, as was very clearly evidenced in the film, we are critical not because it's a fun label to put on the industry, but because we are critical to national security and social order.
You're the glass jaw of American life.
I wouldn't put it that way. I would say we certainly, all of the other critical sectors are dependent upon us, and certainly social order is as well. Right. But that responsibility to keep that power on or to limit the consequences of a successful attack, because there's no such thing as risk elimination. What we're doing here is risk management. And by managing the risk in an appropriate way and doing our role both as government, individuals, and industry to socialize everybody's responsibility so that people understand we're not doing nothing. And you shouldn't be doing nothing either. And back to the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, in fact, at a very high level, the industry and the government are not doing nothing together in a very, very aggressive way.
Let me ask a general question to the group. I was in New York in 1977. I just moved to Manhattan when the lights went out. And I was in New York by chance in August of 2003 during the blackout. These were not my fault. Those two blackouts are very different. In one, there was widespread arson and looting, and some murder, etc. And in 2003, there was none, and there was none anywhere to speak of in the East. In fact, people were out on the streets. Things might have been calmer than usual. I don't know why. How do you prepare the population? How do you set the tone? We saw the borrowed sound clip from President Obama. The good news is we're going to get through this. He was, I think, talking about Sandy. How do you set the tone in a way that people pull together and get through it, and we don't end up as Lord of the Flies?
Well, I actually was from New Jersey. I remember the 77 blackout. I was in Manhattan as well during the 2003. I mean, one of the things that quite frankly was a factor was that was the same community that had been through 9/11. And had come together with a solidarity and a belief and a conviction in mutual aid. And there was a calmness, you're right, about life in Manhattan. And there were the crisis dragged on for some, and nerves were frayed, and people began to lose patience. But I think we should come back to the fact that the electricity sector is not doing nothing. I mean, together with the Department of Energy and Homeland Security and other parts of the government, the sector has begun to develop maturity models, not only to prevent a cyber attack from addressing it, but addressing workforce needs. I mean, one of the real issues that we need to address for cybersecurity, not just the technology, but what kind of expertise do we really need among our cyber experts to help prevent these and restore power as quickly as possible?
A good point.
I mean, I do like your question, what can we do to prevent violence, and how do we set the tone? And one of the things we can do is sort of what I've been talking about is building community. Because once you have relationships, I think a lot of the problems in big urban cities and maybe in American culture at large is that people live close together, but they don't form tight communities. And I think if there's 9/11 was an excellent example where the whole sort of city came together sort of under some sort of unified goal and direction and worked beautifully together, and we didn't see any violence, and we saw, ordinary people doing remarkable things. So I think to the degree that you can get the community sort of working together, planning, building those relationships, that will set the tone for less violence and a willingness to work in partnership.
Maybe we just need to believe Al-Qaeda did it, and then we'll pull together on it.
Exactly.
I would just add, and I think both of those are right, but I also think that, we have, as a nation, as a city, as a community, as a family, sort of recognize the need to develop, build, and sustain certain capabilities. And one of those capabilities is actually trust. Right. Trust amongst one another, but also trust in systems, whether they be government or faith-based nonprofit in the case of the Red Cross. And so what we have said is, look, we can't do everything. Our contribution to helping the American during times of crisis is our contributions to preparing, responding, and recovering. We don't do prevention, we don't do protection, and we really don't do mitigation in the traditional sense. And so when you look at the examples you gave from New York in the 70s, New York 2003, post 9/11, if you think about Hurricane Irene, I don't remember what year that was, but it was only a couple of years ago. The effects in New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and Vermont and Maine were not undifferent than the effects of Sandy. The scope and the scale were a little bit different. People learned a little bit about understanding how the industry, or at least the infrastructure on the electric side of the house, responds and what the typical timeline is. And all of a sudden, here in D.C. with the derecho, and in Maryland and parts of Virginia, you understood you were going to be out of power for 3 or 4 days. And so there's a bit of a psychology around what your expectations are, not only of yourself and of your community and your responders, but what that means as you think about your planning needs going forward, and what are your capabilities? Does that mean you got enough money in your pocket for a night stay somewhere, or does that mean you've got a generator and a separate house with a bunch of stuff in it up in the mountains?
The bug-out house.
Right.
Let me ask, actually, if we can circulate the question cards and pass them forward. I was struck about how communications addicted we've become. In the 1977 blackout, nobody complained that their cell phone didn't work. There were no cell phones. Is there anything we can do to cope with we have this strong dependence now on instant communication with everybody, and that's going to be one of the first things to go?
Again, if you don't have an informed population, you don't have a stable population. People will take matters into their own hands. I think what we have seen and learned over time, tragically in some cases through repetition of significant events that affect whole communities, that governments are responding. Local government, the mayor of New York City is out within an hour talking to the population, telling them what he knows, what is known, pushing out information. People have demonstrated they can cope without their cell phone for several days. Again, you saw that in New York City, and it's done elsewhere. Coping without your cell phone is not the same thing as coping without information. And again, it comes back to preparedness at individual levels. How do you reduce the likelihood that you will add to the community of victims? Don't do that. I mean, there's an old saying among responders, 72's on you. Can you equip yourself to cope without electricity, and have those kinds of things? I mean, some people take it very seriously. But all of us can do the sensible steps that the Red Cross puts out, for example, or cities do to be prepared.
What's 72s on you?
The first 72 hours of a crisis, you should be prepared to cope with that, and not add yourself to the roles of victims, because there will be, in New York City, a lot of high-rise buildings, elderly population, electronically dependent population.
And electric can openers.
And what we've learned, though, is that too many of our systems have been designed for efficiency and not for resilience. We need to take a look at that.
I think there are two excellent points. I think one is managing expectations, another is situational awareness. So, we need to involve the community more with our communication redundancies that we're building in governments and cities and healthcare industries, so that we can get information quickly out to the cities, out to the community, whether it be through 800 megahertz radios or ham radios or whatever the technology is. But an informed population often does not escalate to violence, if we're managing those expectations and giving them the information that they need.
Do we have an undue focus on this? Has this become sort of the locus of our anxiety? We used to worry about AIDS, we used to worry about nuclear war. Now we worry about the grid, or we worry about cyber. Is this in proportion? Is this one of the bigger risks we actually face? Do we know how big a risk it is?
No, we don't. And that's one of the difficulties. We can imagine catastrophic scenarios, but if you'd have begun this by asking me, well, can that happen? I probably would have answered, not very likely.
Right.
Just because of the nature of the weapon that would have to be used, the nature of the grid that's being attacked, the biodiversity that's actually in the network, and that helps the species, the electrical grid, survive. On the other hand, we've had several prominent Americans say, former Secretary of Defense, that the next Pearl Harbor will be a cyber Pearl Harbor. And that's not slogan mongering either. And so we're feeling our way. One of the biggest challenges we have is actually trying to articulate threat and what actually represents a reasonable response to a reasonable definition of threat. This is the kind of thing in which you can spend all your money on it, and that's not right.
And I think we do need to know more about threats, but we don't need to not act before we know everything there is to know about threats. Those of us who have children send them out the door every day, and we don't sort of give them a list, and I'll pay attention to this streptococcal virus or that particular disease, that you wash your hands, look both ways before crossing the street, don't talk to strangers. The basic hygiene of coping in your everyday life, we're not doing enough in cyber. Again, those top four that I mentioned and keep mentioning and will continue to mention are the things we can do right now at no or low cost to reduce our vulnerability. Again, while those who need to focus on the upper end of the threat spectrum can do so.
I would just chime in. I think there's always an attraction to the very low probability but very high consequence events. And I think our country and many others, having learned from Fukushima and certainly Haiti and other events, have developed a very good understanding of not only the initial impacts of a power outage, but the cascading impacts of a prolonged power outage, which just amplify and multiply lots of things. It's, if you had a flat tire on your car, you could probably get along. But if your alternator's out, then everything else starts to break down. And people are becoming sensitive to the multiple impacts across multiple sectors, not only of the economy and the transportation systems and the communication systems and all what that means to this society in our country. And you mentioned Japan. In my estimation, there's probably no better prepared culture in the world of sort of understanding their threats and vulnerabilities, and to Jane's point, doing something about it.
To your original question about are we paying too much attention to this, the high consequence, low probability events, I'd say even works of fiction like this, which sort of generate a conversation about preparation, about all the different stakeholders who are working to be prepared and working to defend this nation and to defend our infrastructure. I think anything that raises the level of that discourse so that people are a little bit more understanding of what is plausible and what is not, and what is likely and what is not, I think is a useful exercise. And with respect to cyber versus maybe some of the other more traditional attacks of terrorism, or then even going to the acts of God, I think and I know Jane's going to disagree a little bit on this. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the vector of attack was. There was a power disruption. And what we do as a matter of course, and what we've done for decades on physical effects to the grid, is to begin to start to restore things. With cyber, that's going to be exactly the same thing with a couple of extra unknowns thrown in. So I think to begin to socialize those unknowns as we deal with a threat that is not going away. We have digital infrastructure that is helping to run, or digital overlays are helping to run our infrastructure. That is a good thing. It helps us to be more efficient. It helps us to have better situational awareness of what's happening, but it also introduces new threats.
It also enables everything from Edward Snowden to, it enables massive transfers of secrets in a way that now reveal that we don't keep secrets very well. We don't find disaffected contractors. Snowden didn't even work for the government. He was a contractor. How do we secure ourselves? How do we secure the human element here?
Sure. What's happened because of the information age is that we've pushed power. We've pushed the ability to do stuff down. All right? Again, I'm old enough to remember that it required me going to a building and talking to a human being to get my money.
Right.
All right? I can do that now with a couple of clicks. I can do that now with a card and a machine. We've all been tremendously empowered, and that's great, and we live better for it. But it's also pushed the power to do harm down to sub-state actors, that even down to the level of individuals.
Right.
You know, we've had stupid privates in the American Army since Valley Forge, all right? But none have been as empowered as Bradley Manning.
Right.
In terms of doing harm. The same thing with Edward Snowden. So what worries me, connecting this question to our movie, is I'm really not too concerned about a nation state trying to do that. I mean, if a sophisticated near-peer nation state was trying to do that, we've probably got a lot of other problems going on, all right? And this would be only one. But I'm fearful as this trend goes forward and power gets pushed down, we may see the ability to cause harm we used to associate with nation states residing with the disaffected individual with undefined and unsatisfiable demands. And that's a more scary scenario.
Right.
I do just want to say that one of the things that I ticked off earlier was limited administrative permissions that are given out. I mean, that's just basic hygiene. People matter in this equation. We all know you can have a shiny, the most fancy new VCR, or we don't even use those anymore. We all stream. Some of us still have them. But if you don't know how to use it, it's ridiculous. So the human element is not trivial to this equation. But we need to think of both of them together. But there are, again, basic hygiene that would prevent some of our vulnerability and some of our exposures.
We have one question from the audience, and then we'll wrap it up. It is addressed to General Hayden, Ms. Lute, and Mr. Aronson, but anyone would like to chime in. What's the appropriate role for the federal government in private sector cybersecurity, and what legal changes are necessary to affect that role? And I would throw in that the grid has approximately 500 separate owners, and access to the computer system of the grid is in even more hands. What legal changes, what structural changes do we need?
I'll start. And this idea is beyond half-baked, but it's not fully done yet, all right? But, in military terms, when we give an operations order, we'll tell people who is the supported commander and who are the supporting commands. And a Civil War order would be written like, you will conform your movements to the movements of the main body. I think in the cyber domain, we've kind of thought of the government as the supported command and the private sector as supporting. I mean, how do we get information from the private sector to the government and so on? I actually think this may stand some thinking that the main effort here is actually the private sector.
Uh-oh.
And that the government needs to shape its movements to more enable the private sector to better defend itself in this domain. Now look, we talk about the very high-end threats, all right? And I don't care how good you are in the private sector. If a near-peer nation state's coming after you, they're getting in. And so there is a certain defined role that has to be the government. But I do think what the movement we'll see is legislation and law that more enables the private sector to do things to defend itself and allows the government to provide it the kind of support it might need.
I guess I would largely agree with that, but I think also, there are three categories of people that are going to make a real difference on cybersecurity, at least in a hurry. One are the technologists, the CIOs, the CTOs, who know these basic hygiene steps that should be taken and have the latitude within their organization to begin implementing them in a straightforward way that's communicable to boards and CEOs and said, look, we're not in good shape, and here's how we fix it, and they begin with the hygiene. They're going to be those who are decision makers in their organizations who say, you know what, I know we're not okay. And I see there are respected sources of information out there that tell me what to do to get okay, and we're going to move down that path. And then there are the large organizations, for example, like the Red Cross or others, that are going to adopt best behavior and send a signal. We hear too often from the private sector, there's no demand function. Consumers aren't demanding cybersecurity. Well, they are demanding best business practice. And they are demanding that you competently safeguard their information and their identity while it's in your care. And frankly, boards of directors need to get in the game. Mike's right, the private sector will be active here and should be, and we should put expectations on them. Should Congress act? Congress should act. We need to create an environment where people have a right to have their information and identities protected, and that will require, in part, legislation, but the private sector doesn't have to wait for that.
So building on that a little bit, people make the case, there's not a business case for reliability. Well, yes, actually there is. It's a little crass, but if our equipment isn't spinning, we aren't making money. So in fact, beyond our responsibility as owners and operators of critical infrastructure, there's a business case for making sure that the lights stay on. With respect to the question about government versus the private sector responsibility, we'll take the hypothetical. If an airplane were deliberately crashed into a power plant, nobody would ask, well, why utility X did you not have an Air Force? And so the same is sort of true of cybersecurity. That said, I think it goes back to that idea of a shared responsibility. With respect to legislation, a lot of people like to talk about information sharing. And there is legislation that would facilitate better information sharing between the government and the private sector. We support that strongly, and we think that would be fantastic. But there's more to information sharing. It's not just information sharing, it's close coordination between the government and the private sector. So what the ESCC, the Sector Coordinating Council, is focusing on are three things. One is information flow, making sure the right people get the right information at the right time so that they can make appropriate decisions to protect their networks. The second is incident response. Again, remembering we're not eliminating threat, we are managing it. There could come a time when there is a power disruption as a result of some sort of physical cyber attack or certainly weather events. Try as we might, we've not outlawed blackouts. And then the last thing that I would say that we're doing is we're talking about threats that literally move at the speed of light. So getting the humans out of it entirely and actually doing machine-to-machine information sharing. The way I put it more colloquially is the government has some pretty cool toys. We would like to deploy those on our systems so that we can increase our preparedness, our ability, our situational awareness, and our ability to respond. And I think that that's something that this very high-level government industry coordination is going to see fruits of that labor very, very soon. And that's all for the best.
I would just like to take this conversation out of cybersecurity and just put it on emergency management in general. Focusing on the private sector, communities, individuals, empowering them, having expectations, information sharing. I think that's really where the opportunity lies, to actually create a nation that could actually, be quite resilient to a threat even as significant as the one depicted in the
Preparing
movie.
for this could help us with other problems too.
Exactly.
Very good. Thank you all. You've been a very polite audience. I know it's past your bedtime. And you all want to get home before the lights go out.